Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Welcome back to 1033. Today I am honored to bring on to the show Nick Motycka. Nick Motycka comes to us from two different services. He was an RCMP officer and also a Calgary police officer with combined service of over 17 years. His journey began when he was 25, where he first became a police officer. He is now retired, and he too has a story about post-traumatic stress and how it impacted himself, his family, and how it's shifted him into a different path in life. And I couldn't be more proud, Nick, of how hard you've had to work to get even to this point, to come onto a podcast to share your experience. So thank you for being here today, Nick.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, I feel the same way. I'm proud of you as well for your journey and speaking out and bringing this to the world.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. It obviously took me some time to get to this place, even for myself, to be able to share my story. But this season is less about me and actually more about others and sharing their stories, so that other people that are in the first responder world can see kind of, other aspects or perspectives of their own stories and maybe relate to different people. And that's a very powerful piece, is being able to share your story and taking all of these different stories from first responders who have gone through so much, sharing it and being able to reflect on kind of how parts of people's stories, the different parts, can be taken into your own story. And that was kind of the cool thing that I learned even from my own journey. But before we go super, super deep and start going down that path, I just want to paint a picture kind of who you are. So if you don't mind sharing kind of and telling us who you are and kind of where your journey began.
Certainly. So I grew up in a police household. So my dad was a member of the RCMP. So I grew up in that world, which no doubt had influences on me that led me to make the choice to pursue this as a career. I don't remember specifically the moment that happened, but looking back, I can tell that growing up with that father working for a police service with the benefits and the pension and the stability of it definitely formed part of my reasons, I guess, why I chose this as a career. And then some reflection more recently I've looked at even some inner child stuff, and I think for me, it was a way for me to be seen as an adult. So going back a little bit, so as a child, I didn't feel like a real priority, or I was really seen by my parents. And so I think law enforcement was a way for me to put on a uniform and to be seen, not only by my parents, but by the public at large. So I believe that all went into it. So as a young man, I made that decision, and through stubbornness, I just pushed through and made it happen. I worked in various security type jobs once I was an adult, uniform security and loss prevention and Canada Customs as a summer student, bylaw services as a summer student, and then with court and prisoner services, doing the court security and the prisoner transport in Alberta. and that whole time applying to various police services. So it definitely wasn't something that just happened for me with my first application. I applied with the RCMP originally as a 19-year-old and was deferred for good reason. I was not ready. And I, from there, then went and got my, it was my diploma in justice, or sorry, it was actually criminology, and then applied again with Calgary Police and was deferred. And so I stayed in school, got my degree in applied justice studies from Mount Royal in Calgary, and reapplied with Calgary once my deferral was up, and they deferred me again. And at that point I decided Calgary was where I wanted to be, just for the stability of it and not having to worry about transfers and whatnot. But after that second deferral from Calgary, I decided to reapply with the RCMP. And at that point I was 25. And I remember sitting in the room in the Duncan building in Calgary, auditorium full of, I don't know, maybe 100 guys and girls. And I remember the recruiter saying that only about 2 of you are going to make it into Dell. And I remember looking around and wondering which other person was going to be with me there. I just had this really unfounded confidence that I was going to make it happen. And I did. And so I started at Depot in August of 2005.
The beginning chapter of your story is so crucial. I don't think I've come across too many people who actually hold the awareness as to why they actually become a police officer later on in life. There are conscious decisions to do so. There are subconscious decisions to do so. And I'm actually very glad that you were able to touch on something that was so, I think, important for all of us to reflect on, is the reason of why do we become a police officer. Even for myself, I know I joined the service because I had a big heart and I wanted to help people. But below that, it wasn't until I left when I finally realized my own subconscious wiring, the reasons why I was, nudging along this path to become a police officer at that time. Now, going back to your own journey, did you hold awareness into why you were becoming a police officer, or was it kind of just like you had to commit to this and this was your dream? And where was your awareness with all of that?
Yeah, it was subconscious for sure. The elements I talked about there with the inner child stuff, for me, it was that service and wanting to help people and wanting to be involved in those moments where people truly needed help. So that was my conscious reasoning. But looking back now, and again, since I've been off and retired, and then with the help of my wife, actually, she was the one that came up with that awareness, I guess, of that inner child piece. And one night she just told me that exact thing, and I thought about it for a moment. I was quiet, and I think she was really she was worried that she had hurt my feelings, and I was just quiet because it was like just this truth hammer just hit me like a ton of bricks, and it was a real eye-opening moment for me. So that was definitely on the subconscious side.
Beautiful. Having the ability to hold awareness into accepting that the narrative that you've told yourself as to why you became a police officer for many, many years, and now finally confronting kind of the iceberg, the part of the ice chunk that holds below the surface of the water. And those subconscious realities to us are very, very deep. And it's not until later on, a lot of times in life, where we understand why we do the things we do them. And I too had a very similar experience as to you, and I'm very glad you can touch on that, because I think it's probably going to nudge people to maybe dive deeper into why they became a police officer or a paramedic or a firefighter or whatever the case is. And holding awareness into your past and the childhood trauma is so important in being able to heal from PTSD down the road. Now, I'm already getting way ahead of myself, so I want to come back to you and your story. What were some of the things that you noticed about yourself going into policing? Like, what kind of person were you? Can you just take a moment to describe kind of who you were at that time?
For sure. So I was naive, number one, and thought that I would be able to just put on that uniform and help people nonstop and just be in that position to really impact people and right some wrongs in the world. And so that naive, how I was approaching the world was from a very naive place. I hadn't had any real, nothing traumatic had really ever happened to me in my life. I'd never lost anyone close to me. I'd never had really anything even, I had a pretty smooth childhood. So I think that all built into my how naive I was. But I joined for the right reasons, in my opinion. I genuinely did want to help people. I always had a strong moral compass, and that's how I lived at that point. It was, I knew that I wanted to be a police officer, so I stopped doing all of the things and wouldn't do any of the things that would jeopardize that, because I saw how important it was to be in, not, you can't be in that position and say one thing to the people you're dealing with and then do something different when you're at home or when the public eye isn't on you. So I always had that as part of my personality and part of my being. And so beyond naive, at 25 years old, I was just looking, I guess, to make my stamp on the world, and to just try and just help people in any way I could through policing. And then I guess more on the selfish side, I definitely had a bit of a attraction to adrenaline, let's say. So skiing fast, motorcycles, all of that sort of thing was always a real big part of my life. And so policing definitely filled that adrenaline need for me as a young man.
To go a bit deeper too, even into this question of the who or what kind of person we are prior to law enforcement, looking back, are you able to reflect too on the level of compassion or the emotional range that you possessed prior to becoming a police officer? And maybe the range of the mood. We've established kind of the moral compass and all those beautiful things, and maybe some of the naive aspects of you. But how were some of those inner workings, and what were your relationships like with people prior to becoming a cop?
So as you're asking that question, I think of a volunteer position that I had as a young man. I was in college at the time, so would have been around 2021. I volunteered at the distress center in Calgary. So it's a crisis line, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's available for people to call in when they're in crisis situations. So I'm in there as a 21-year-old guy who's never had anything bad really happen to them in their life. And I really struggled in that position because I had no frame of reference for that compassion. So I figured out very quickly that I wasn't a counselor so much as a first responder. And I think at that point, I really just made the decision that the policing side of it and going into those crazy situations and just dealing with whatever it is and then moving on was more of what appealed to me more than the I guess more compassionate counseling and really coaching through people through those hard moments. So that was an awareness I had even before policing.
The relationships too that you would have had around that time, do you think that you had any anxiety, any kind of depression, any kind of angst about wanting to go out and be social? It sounds like you were probably someone who was a social person. You had the ability to connect with others, and you made it a part of your life to be able to go out and to connect with others. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I had a good solid group of friends at that time, who a lot of them are still good friends to this day. So yeah, had that ability absolutely to connect to people, and from all different walks of life as well. And that was always something that I was aware of, was to have friends outside of the enforcement world. It was a conscious thing for me, even at that point, to have those friendships and to have something to talk about outside of the enforcement world.
Absolutely. Those are the support systems that we naturally just have in our lives. Now, when we jump into policing, and especially for you, Nick, when you jump into policing, what did that look like for you? Like, what were some of the things you were experiencing? What were some of the internal things you were experiencing with the body? And what were some of those harder calls? What did that all look like?
So for me, when I got into uniform, into the police car after training, one of the first things that really struck me, and I guess disappointed me about humanity, I think more than anything, was the amount of lies that a police officer gets told in a day, right from that first traffic stop, the old lady that rolls a stop sign and she lies to you and you're standing at the window. And it was really a disheartening thing for me to realize that people don't view you always in that enforcement role as the person that's there to help them. They view you more as the adversary, or someone they have to hide something from because they don't want to get into trouble. And so for me, that was really an eye-opening thing right off the hop. And then as my time progressed and started going to those harder calls, for me, and especially now looking back, the suicide calls, the threats of suicide and the actual suicides were definitely some of the hardest, and the ones that stuck with me, that I just bottled up and pushed down up until very recently, when it just came boiling up to the surface and I was forced to deal with those.
Why your experience with people that were not being truthful to you, is there something that you can dig deeper on or reflect on that was something for you that you can shine a light on why that bothered you so much before we start jumping into the trauma? Because it sounds like a pretty important part of your journey, obviously. It sounds like you were a very truthful person, get thrust into this position of expecting others to be truthful for you. And I too went through the exact same thing as a police officer. I was flabbergasted at how many people lie to you and through their teeth. Yeah. Why was that such a big thing for you?
I guess it was part of that wanting to help people piece. And I guess assumed that people wanted help. And then to see when you go to that domestic and the victim, who's the person that called you to come, all of a sudden you're being lied to by them. And then the person that is under arrest is definitely lying to you in most cases. And to see all of a sudden that you really can't trust anyone in policing, even the victims, which always I had a really hard time with, because that then becomes how you deal with everyone that you come into contact with. And that is that you're treating them like they're not telling you the truth. So you get that call of that sexual assault, and you walk into that situation and you have that, or I would have that energy of, are you really telling me the truth here? And the victim can pick up on that a mile away, and it just starts this negative loop. And unfortunately, it's just the way that you have to deal with people in policing. And that really always bothered me, was that you couldn't trust anyone really to be telling you the truth unless obviously there was evidence otherwise. So that was a really hard thing for me right from day one, right up until my last shift.
How is that impacting your ability to have the standard of compassion that you came into policing with, Nick?
It devastated that for sure. I became jaded and bitter and not the person that I wanted to be. And unfortunately, it was just, I think, my coping mechanism to get through those calls and to get through my day was just to kind of almost treat people in certain situations as less than human, and as a way to just get through it. And that always bothered me. And I think that's probably because of my moral compass and whatnot, and the reasons why I came into the career. And now all of a sudden I was having to act and be a way that I didn't want to be, but it was the only way I knew how to get through it.
One of the things I want to support you on in this train of thought too is that there's no shame in the person that you are becoming as a police officer. I too share a very similar experience of coming in with a certain standard of compassion and being lied to my face for years, and that ability to now be compassionate to people that are not allowing you to help them. Because for most calls, I would say 100% of the reasons, or 100% of the calls that I was going to, I always tried to be compassionate. And your compassion meter just slowly gets kicked down until it's basically gone. And compassion fatigue is a very real thing in policing. For some, it happens much later. For some, it happens much sooner. And it's very interesting to kind of get your perspective on how these aspects of policing, the lack of trust and the standard of compassion that you come into the career with, were challenged because of the way people were treating you because of the uniform that you were wearing. You were there for the best reason ever. You were there to help people in a certain way. You may be pulling people over. You may be having to deal with them in a way that law enforcement officials do. You have to challenge people on the things that they're doing in their life. But for the most part, we show up and we still have a huge heart behind that badge and behind that uniform. And I love how you were able to reflect on this impact that definitely played into your ability to be compassionate towards others. Again, and was this something you were aware of while you were going through it?
No. It was a slow burn for me. And as you were just talking there, I was thinking to myself how this is the first time in my life I've had this conversation, like to really go back and look at the person I was before, and then into my training. And then once I was out on the street, on the job. And it's crazy to think that, yeah, this is the first time, and to realize like, oh, I'm not the only one here that went through that same exact thing. So it's we could definitely do better in the profession to prepare people for this, because it is the world that you're going to be in.
One of the things that I loved about what you had just said was the fact too earlier on how you clearly are able to recognize the person that you were when you started the journey of being a police officer. And as it gets eroded into this person who's, has got these cynical traits to them, they're very negative now, and they might be starting to show signs or symptoms of PTSD. You said it's a very normal thing to have to go through these events. So you actually have a form of acceptance of the person you are becoming, because now at this stage of the journey, you can look back and see it with clarity. And for myself too, Nick, I didn't understand the person I was becoming as a result of being a police officer until years later, when I finally started to deal with all of this PTSD stuff, and even learned even more in retirement, because you have now the time to look back and go, how did I get so lost in this journey? And the challenges of policing are very much there. I would argue that most people, a very high percentage, over 80, 90% of our people are going to go through this. This story, I can tell already, is going to help others kind of shine a light on kind of where they're at in that junior years of service, because there is a very real transition and shift that occurs with who you are. And it happens in a way that it's kind of unbeknownst to you. You don't really pick up on it. And I always use the analogy of the frog in the pot of boiling water. The water's getting warmer and the water's getting warmer. Well, eventually that water is going to get to a point where it's boiling, and now you're facing PTSD. So I want to take a moment for you to kind of reflect on, you touched on some of the calls that were very significant to you, and I think that was the suicides. If you want to share a story and maybe try to water it down so that we don't absolutely trigger people, I'd love to kind of hear kind of how that impactful call for you impacted you, and maybe some of the things that you now recognize from your place of, you know, you're on your healing journey and you're now able to look back at it and go, okay, this is what I actually experienced. Because even on those calls too, I'm sure you can relate with the idea that when you're in the call, your training kicks in, you shove your emotions down, you deal with the call, and you move on to the next call, and you maybe don't have all the time in the world to process what you just went through and what you experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely rings true for me. So the first one that comes to mind was I believe an attempted suicide. And again, to kind of explain how I don't know, is my coping mechanism at the time was to just go in, do my job, and then write up whatever paperwork I needed to do, shove down any emotions, and on to the next one. So I actually don't even know if she ended up dying or not. But so it was a assist EMS call. They were holding back for a suicidal female, and so I arrived, and I had backup with me, and so I just went around. It was a basement suite, so went to the back door of this house and was met with the girl who the call was about, and she had cut both of her wrists. And so every time her heart would beat, the blood was spurting out. And so I don't want to go into too many details here, but that call and then the way it unfolded. So the smells, the sights, so I'll just kind of a funny-ish part of that. So it was wintertime. She was wearing a down jacket. And once we were able to restrain her, because she was fighting us and trying to fight EMS. And so once she was on the ground, and so EMS had to cut off her down jacket. And so there was feathers everywhere and blood. And then she'd smashed every piece of glass in her place. So they're broken glass. And then the smell of Smirnoff green apple vodka, which is what she drank to get the courage to do what she'd done. And so the smells and the whole thing, it just, well, even now, like as I'm describing it, I've processed this trauma successfully through, which we'll get into later. But even now, like I can see it, I can smell it, I can taste it. But for me, I've gotten to a place where it's still a memory, obviously, but it doesn't hold an emotional charge over me, which for me, that was a huge breakthrough that I was just very recently able to get to this point. So that call definitely for me was the first one that stands out as something that I had as trauma that I never processed. So went straight from that one. It was probably a quick change of my pants to get the blood off and on to the next one. There was no debrief, no talk about that call ever again. And then for me, every time I would smell artificial green apple or, be reminded of anything that would bring me back there, it would start to come up as this traumatic incident. And then I would be like, nope, not today, sir. And I would just push it back down and just avoid it. And that served me up until September 16th of 2020.
There's a very real impact to everything that happens in those moments. And I'm sure I'm going to let you have an opportunity to go back to this story because I think it's really crucial. The brain, when we enter into our own state of fight or flight as a result of something that we're now dealing with, a trauma, is recording everything. We're recording in great detail the sights, the sounds, the smells, the way things feel when we touch them, right? Even walking on the glass, I'm sure you could feel the glass breaking below your feet if you were there, right? I can recall so many details to all of these different traumatic events that I went through. And I'd love to hear kind of the impact in the moment, or at least the range of things that you were experiencing in the body as you showed up on that call. Maybe there was some fear going to the call. And that's something too, as police officers, we don't often talk a lot about, is we are human, but sometimes we are scared shitless to go to these calls. I don't know how many calls I went to where I had to shove my fear down, way down, because nobody else was going. It was me. I was the one that had to go. I couldn't turn around and say, no, sorry, I got to tap out of this one. I'm scared. Can't go. You were going. Do you want to talk about some of the things you maybe went through internally during that call, Nick?
Yeah. So more recently, but the awareness of energy and people's energy and my own energy was something that I was very, I guess, unaware of going back to that point in my life. And then your intuition and your gut and all of those things are screaming at you like, what are you doing? Like, do not go there. But like you touched on, that literally is your job. And so you have to push aside all of your natural reactions to a situation, push them all down, ignore them all, and go in and do what you have to do. And looking back now at how sensitive I am to people's energy, and to realize the things that the situations I just walked into under my own strength, would be something that I couldn't do now, and I wouldn't do that to myself. But in the moment, I just found a way, I guess, to ignore all of those signs and things that were going on internally for me, and just got in there and did what I had to do, because that literally was my job.
The cost of service for our servicemen and women is very apparent in the calls that they go to. We still are human. We are trained very well to deal with high stress, dynamic situations, and make sure people hopefully come out of there okay, including ourselves. But we are not trained on how to deal with the internal rumblings of what's going on with the body as we walk into these calls. I never had an experience with the Mounties in depot where they trained me emotionally how to deal with, certain things. Sure, they put in place, make sure you're healthy, make sure you're working out and you're doing your fitness and you're eating well and you're staying hydrated and all those beautiful things. But not once did we talk about the emotional impact of going to these calls. And that was back in 2007. I don't know where we're at right now with training. I hope things are, if they haven't improved, they are moving in that direction, because so many people are now going to go and fill your shoes. You've left. You understand everything that you went through. But even in those moments of having the training to step into that call where there was that suicidal person and this theme of, okay, you know what? I'm going to shut down emotionally so I don't get overwhelmed and I can deal with this situation. While a lot of us take that approach, it still starts to add layers of trauma to that onion or to that rock. And we then after shift off and we go into the next call, right? Like you mentioned, you changed your pants and then you just moved on and you didn't really talk about what you experienced. And that's the unfortunate part with policing, is our servicemen and women don't have the time afterwards to decompress, to get what they experienced out. And that is a huge thing that I've learned with the battle with PTSD, is if you take that time and you have that connection and you have that community and the support behind you to deal with the hard things that you're going through and you're going to see as a police officer or paramedic or whatever, you're going to build in a component of being healthy and hopefully more longevity to your service life. And that is a huge way to prevent a lot of this stuff. And I hope in time, and I'm sure you can agree with this, Nick, that things in policing change, because they need to change. There needs to be way more support around this stuff. And now as you go through this traumatic call and you go on to your next incident, how many of these calls did you go through where you knew that they were abnormal for you and there was now an impact to you? Can you say roughly that number?
So with the benefit of hindsight, for me, there's 5 incidents throughout my career that I never dealt with and didn't have the tools to deal with, and was never shown, I guess, how to appropriately process those traumas. So for me, there's 5 that really stuck with me, that ended up boiling up and to the point where I had a full-on breakthrough at work. I call it a breakthrough. I originally called it a breakdown, but now looking back, it was 100% a breakthrough. So for me, they just piled on top of each other, and then I just kept pushing them down every time they would come up. And that served me for close to 16 years. And then one day it was just the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And I had a full on breakthrough at work.
I love how you call it a breakthrough and not a breakdown. I think in the moments when we do break down and we recognize in that moment we are not well, we look at it as a breakdown in every aspect of our health, our spiritual, our physical, our emotional, our mental. Everything is gone. It's out the window. Our world is now spinning in PTSD. And when you hit that moment, it's both beautiful and disgusting at the same time. Because if you do things correctly and you reach out and you get the help that you need and you deserve, you can flourish and you can go down the path of post-traumatic growth. Now, some people unfortunately take a different turn and they fall down into addiction or suicide or what have you. But I'm glad to hear that in that moment, at least now you can look back and say this was maybe a breakdown in the moment, but now that I can look back because of where I've gone and challenged myself, it is a breakthrough. The other thing I want to touch on real quick too, Nick, is the fact that you talk about there are 5 big incidents for you that are kind of those big trauma ticket items. Now, the other thing I want to cross off too and kind of just get you to reflect on, even though you experienced 5 big traumatic events, how many small traumatic events were you experiencing now through being a police officer?
Yeah, hundreds for sure. Yeah. They're probably things that I can't even put my finger on any of the details of, but it just, again, the nature of the job, it'd be hundreds, absolutely, that are just so outside of what humans should be seeing on a day-to-day basis. And for me, I think it just all compounded and compounds on, stacks on top of each other, and gets to a point where unless you process them, it doesn't go anywhere. It stays in your body. And I got to a point where my coping mechanism of just pushing things down was no longer working, and they all came up. And it was an amazing thing for me, because even in that moment, I just had this awareness that, okay, I've been ignoring you for way too many years, and now it's time to actually get the help that I need and process these things. So it was a beautiful moment and a very sad moment at the same time, but it absolutely needed to happen for me, because I was not, otherwise I would have never dealt with my stuff if I wouldn't have been forced to.
One of the things that I find interesting too about your story as well, Nick, is not only did you serve as an RCMP, but you also serve as a CPS. You patched over, as we like to call it. Now, from your experience, what was your experience like working as a RCMP officer in the world of trauma compared to, say, CPS and experiencing trauma? Was there any distinct differences between the two organizations and how they approach what their men and women go through?
There is differences, absolutely. I can't say if it wasn't just a different time too, because my RCMP service happened before my CPS service, and things I think are getting better in terms of awareness of PTSD and the debriefs and all of the things that need to happen. But in the RCMP, you're by yourself, right? You're in a one-man car and you're going to a lot of these calls by yourself. And I mean, you do have backup, but you're not in that car with someone else where you're sharing what's going on, even if it's just kind of banter in the car. So the biggest difference for me going from the RCMP to Calgary was that exact thing. Was once I got to Calgary is we had a partner. And so you're riding around in a car who's going to the exact same call as you, dealing with the exact same things. And then you just have that time and that connection to decompress and have those conversations, and just that shared, I guess, involvement in the same scenario was a big difference. And then as far as the psychological services and whatnot that were available, I didn't access any when I was with the RCMP, and I don't even know if I would have known how to at that time. Whereas with Calgary, I think they do a better job of making those services readily available to their members and having that in your awareness more so.
Yeah, two totally different organizations with their own struggles, I will say, in how they deliver their policing services. The RCMP compared to CPS, totally different police universes, right? And that's kind of something I see too from my own experience. I've only had the opportunity to serve as a Mountie, so I can only tell you from what my own experience is like. But obviously hearing that aspect of the story too, even from you, of, you know, patching over and how you saw a difference. And I can, no doubt, I'm assuming the impact of having a partner with you 24/7 while you're on shift as a CPS officer, no doubt would help, right? Just making sure someone's there. You have the support. You can talk to that person after that call and say, hey, like, that was pretty messed up. Like, did you feel anything weird on that one? Because I'm kind of going through something. Did you, one of the other things too, I think you touched on, was that you maybe didn't necessarily take action on your mental health either during this course in your career, right? Where you're now building up to PTSD. Before we jump into the part of your story where things fall apart, but you can now recognize that as a breakthrough, can you reflect on the person that you were now becoming as a result of everything that you've experienced just prior to having your breakthrough moment?
For me, it was definitely a slow, not a progression, but degradation maybe. So it wasn't something that I was consciously aware of, but with the benefit of hindsight, I can see the changes in my personality and my avoidance of basically anything to do with policing got more and more pronounced as my years went on. So as a young guy just starting out in policing, I was excited to share all of the stories, you know, with friends and family. And then as time went on, I found I couldn't even think of stories to tell people. When someone would say like, oh, tell me a cool story, I couldn't really even think of anything. And then even if I did have something that would pop into my mind, I just didn't want to go there at all. I wanted to just completely separate myself from my position. So I wanted to have my life, and then just that was my job, and I would do my job while I was there, but just separate myself from it once I was off duty. And so I can see that as a shift in me. And then that cynicism and that lack of compassion, and then just from another angle, getting, I guess, beat down by the system that we're dealing with, and that is the justice system. And so it's kind of coming at you from all angles, definitely in my situation. So you're dealing with people, and like we talked about, the amount of, I guess, lies you're sorting through on a daily basis. And then you get someone into the court system, and then the Crown prosecutor is not always on your side, and they're withdrawing charges before trial because of likelihood of conviction. And it's just frustrating, and it beat me down bad. And so I got to a point where I was jaded and bitter, and I didn't even want, unless I had to, I wouldn't even put someone through the justice system. If there was a way to write some tickets or some other way to deal with people, that was my preferred way, rather than to put them into the court system, where if they paid the right amount of money for a lawyer, they were going to get off anyway. And so all of those things just brought me so far away from where I was when I started and where I wanted to be as a person in terms of compassion and the helping of people. I got to a point where I wasn't the person I wanted to be anymore.
You touch on some fairly heavy things, some fairly noticeable changes in your personality and your mood and the way you're able to go about and live your life. You talk about some of the social isolation, the aspects of now starting to having and struggling, connecting with others. And again, I share a very similar experience with my own journey in policing, where it became very hard to connect with others. And I think that's something that we develop trust issues, yes, as a result of the job, because of the lies we're told and everything that happens to us. But we also start to struggle with pushing people away now. We push everyone away. We socially isolate. We don't trust anyone anymore. And the world can feel like it is literally against you. You're struggling at work. You're going to some hard calls. Maybe the organization is coming down on you, or certain aspects in the job, and they're bothering you, right? And you're feeling isolated or alone at work, because those challenges exist very much. And one of the things that Calgary just recently went through was the order to remove I think it was the blue line, right, on the uniform. There was a lot of members that were wearing this patch that had a blue line through it. And it was a sign and a symbol of solidarity amongst the brothers and the sisters of law enforcement, supporting each other. And the Calgary Police Service issued and told their members to not wear that, because it was seen as I believe it was it a racism aspect, or something to do with racism? I didn't quite follow the story. Is that true?
Yeah. So it became a real political issue. So that was after the time when I was off dealing with my PTSD at that point. So I wasn't directly dealing with it, but so it was from a member of the Calgary Police Commission, who is also a member or a counselor with the municipal government in Calgary. He was part of the Black Lives Matter organization, I believe. And so he, and amongst the police commission, they decided that this symbol, this thin blue line, the symbol of solidarity, the remembrance of the men and women that have been killed in the line of duty, all of a sudden, in their opinion, became a symbol of racism in some way. And so due to political influence, the Calgary Police Service basically bowed down to that and ordered that patch not be worn by their members. Luckily, or I don't know if it's lucky or not, but the Calgary Police Association pushed back hard against that. And I don't know where that's at currently, but that at least there was someone on the members' side, because up until more recently, it doesn't really feel like there was a lot of help coming from anywhere else, and just further isolating the men and women in uniform, because you're out there just by yourself it doesn't feel like you have support from really anywhere.
And that's also an important part of the journey, and something that I didn't really recognize until recently was there's not only components and layers to trauma, but there's also layers of sanctuary trauma and moral injuries built into some of the traumatic things that we can go through. And I don't know where you're at even with those words, Nick, if you've reflected on kind of what are some of the moral injuries or the sanctuary trauma that you've gone through. But those two things are very important aspects of trauma as well. The calls that we go to, which are the traumatic ones, which impact us, yes, are very harmful to us. But now when we go to our employer and we may say, hey, I'm looking for support, or I went through something that was incredibly tough, I need support here, I'm asking for help. And a lot of times the organization isn't able to meet its men and women in those pleas for help or connect with them in that moment. And that's called that sanctuary trauma bit, right? So you're almost re-experiencing trauma because you're now saying, hey, I've went through something very difficult, I'm now reaching out to get help. And if it's not met with a delicate, supportive nature behind it, our people are going to re-experience the trauma all over again and not feel supported in what they went through. And that's harmful as well. And then there's also layers of moral injury as well. So these are all things that you're now talking about and having had gone through, even with the justice system. What were some of the justice system issues that really bothered you? Some of the things that you saw, like, I mean, you talked about how, you'd arrest somebody, you'd send them in for charges. And I mean, obviously the grounds were met to arrest these people and charge them and send them forward. Now Crown is, either completely dropping the case for whatever reason, likelihood of conviction or whatever. But that, I think too, is a very important part of our journey as well, and not feeling like we're being supported by the arm of justice. Can you go a little bit deeper into that train of thought, how it looked and why it looked that way, why you feel you weren't supported there, Nick?
Yeah, I felt it pretty much right from the beginning of my career, and that was specifically with impaired drivers. So impaired driving law is so full of, the case law is just, there's so much case law that if the person who's been charged can pay the right amount of money for the right lawyer, pay for the right expert to testify on their behalf, they're almost guaranteed to be able to buy their way out of that charge. And so right from a junior member of the RCMP, I saw that, and it really, really disheartened me to see that someone committed a crime. They caused a collision or they hurt someone, and I had all this evidence, and I saw it all with my own eyes, and I knew what the situation was. And then you get that person into court, and they're walking away with the only repercussion would be a steep lawyer bill. And so that, for me, with the impaireds, happened right from the beginning. And then the way my career progressed, I went into drug work fairly early with the RCMP. And then with the way sentencing works for drug related offenses, specifically trafficking, with mandatory minimums and whatnot, that there's really no reason not to fight it from the accused standpoint. So I spent a ton of time in court with drug trafficking cases, and then saw that again, the same thing that I'd seen with impaireds, that if you could afford the right lawyer, you were going to get, released on bail with just some minor conditions, house arrest and whatnot, even if you were the highest level drug trafficker, literally killing people on a daily basis with your fentanyl and whatnot. Those people were out and about walking amongst us, hurting more people. And then when it came time for trial, it was just not a lot of times, even with evidence the size of a mountain, these people were getting off. And then even if they weren't necessarily getting off, the sentences they wouldn't fit the crime. And so in Sherwood Park is where I was posted with the RCMP. For whatever reason, it became a bit of a hotbed for right at the beginning of the opiate crisis. And that would have been in around 2007. And so I had a front row seat for that, how quickly it deteriorated. And we saw kids. It was a lot of young people in Sherwood Park with money that ended up becoming addicted to these. It was OxyContin at the time, and it was the legitimate ones manufactured by Big Pharma, Purdue Pharmaceutical. And so we saw these kids taking orally oxys, and it was the 80 milligrams at that time. And then within a matter of months, you could see in those traffic stops, like they had the coating scraped off and they were crushing them up and snorting them. A couple months later, you could see the evidence of how they were smoking the pill. And then a couple months later, those same kids were literally injecting these oxy 80s into themselves, and in some cases just an obscene number of them per day. And the price just went crazy too. It was basically $1 a milligram, so $80 for one 80 milligram pill. And we had people that were mainlining, I believe it was 16 80s a day. So whatever $80 times 16 is, like just an obscene amount of money a day. And then to deal with the traffickers of those pills. And when it first was happening, we were kind of assured by the Crown that no, there's no conditional sentence orders for people trafficking pills. And then 6 months pass, and all of a sudden, okay, this drug trafficker just got a CSO for trafficking oxys. And so that just really was disheartening, because you're out there doing everything you can to get these people off the street and to protect people from these just terrible substances. And then there's just no support from the system. They're just slipping through the cracks. And in the meantime, people are literally dying. And so that really, I had a really hard time with that. And then for me, as again, my career progressed into Calgary, I got into drug work with the Calgary Police as well, and was undercover for about 2.5 years. And so it was basically lower to mid-level drug trafficking investigations. But I spent, again, a lot of time in court with drug traffickers and just saw the punishment, and it just doesn't fit the crime at all. And then from there, I went into gang suppression in Calgary. And so at that point was dealing with the highest level guys. And then that just cemented my lack of trust in the system. When you're seeing legitimate high level gang members of the worst kind arrested for 4 counts of first degree murder, and they get released on bail. And so we're doing checks on these guys. They're living in communities beside people that have no idea who they're living beside, that are high level gang members. If the wrong person knew where they lived, there would 100% be bullets flying into that house. And that was just a really tough thing to see, is like we're doing everything we can to protect the public, and the system is just not supporting that at all.
The battle we feel as first responders in this journey, and I think I'm sure you can agree with this, Nick, we join because we think and we feel like we can make the world a better place. And we truly believe that when we join, we are going to do just that. I think even for myself, as I reflect back on kind of where I was in my journey when I first started, I truly believed, and this was also a very naive part of my own rational thought, was the fact that I believed that the justice system was going to be there for myself as well. And the people that I was arresting or trying to ensure that the community was in a good position and we were taking the bad people off the streets and holding them accountable, I too saw just how false that narrative really is. And it was incredibly frustrating for me too, to have to experience that, but also incredibly damaging. I think even from my own stories, and I didn't hear you mention this, but there were a few times that I was assaulted as a police officer, and I was shocked at how many of those charges are dropped. And I couldn't think of a more perfect time to hold someone to account other than when someone attacks a police officer. But yet all of these people that I would send in to Crown and say, here's the charge package, we are recommending charges, Crown would usually turn around and say, no, this wasn't bad enough for this person to be charged. So the lack of support, I mean, you touched on this with such depth and such clarity. We feel it from the justice side of the house. We feel it from the organization, our own organization at times. And now you have this other aspect too of experiencing trauma at work. So for you, you painted a very clear picture of the jaded, cynical, bitter police officer that you had become and where that journey had taken you. What did your breakthrough moment look like?
For me, I realized about it was early 2020. My sleep was starting to really be affected. So I was in it was called a gang suppression team at that time, and we would work 4 12-hour night shifts. So we'd work Wednesday through Saturday from it was 4 to 4 or 5 to 5 on Saturday and Sunday, or for Friday and Saturday night. And so 4 12-hour night shifts in a row. And then we would have a few days off, and then we'd be back for 3-day shifts, and then a couple of days off, and then back to those nights. And so I found my sleep was the first real symptom that I saw that something wasn't right. And that was that I couldn't sleep in between my shifts anymore. I'd wake up, wouldn't get home till 6:30, 7 in the morning. I'd sleep till 9:30, and then I'd be up and then couldn't fall back asleep. And then I still had 3 more 12-hour night shifts to get through. So it would just compound on themselves over those 4 days. And then that first day off, I was just useless. I was no good at home. And then to go back, even those last couple night shifts, I wasn't very good at work either. And so my body was telling me that I needed to make a change. And so my time was coming up through tenure anyways with that position. And so I reached out for help for the first time in my life, actually, and went and saw my doctor and ended up getting my hours restricted to midnight. And then, so that made it so I wouldn't be able to work in GST anymore. And the Calgary Police Service has a 10-year coordinator, and he was really he is a great guy. And so I told him my truth, and he found me a spot in, it was called the Public Affairs and Media Relations Unit. So this is right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so I was working from home on a laptop Tuesday to Friday, day shifts. It was amazing. I was not having to deal with the public directly. I wasn't having to arrest anyone, wasn't having to put anyone through the justice system. At that time, it was the perfect spot for me. And then George Floyd was murdered. And that was in June of 2020. And then all of a sudden, my really nice, cushy internet-based job became the worst position in policing. As that summer progressed into the defund the police movement and the Black Lives Matter stuff, and the things that people would say online was just, I was already pretty disheartened, but that sentiment, and then coming from not only the public, but in Calgary specifically from our own municipal government, they just put us through the ringer that we were all racist and that we were all terrible people. A counselor in Calgary actually said that all police officers are domestic abusers. And it was just a really, really hard time for me specifically. And that online world only exacerbated that, because the things people say behind a keyboard are things that would never be said to your face. And we get told a lot of bad things directly to our face as a police officer. So that you can imagine how bad it was online at that time. So I pushed through that summer, and it was again a slow kind of fall, I guess, and where I wasn't aware of it at the time, other than it was dark for sure, but I didn't have a lot of awareness into it. And then sometime in that summer, I started, a girl messaged us. So as part of that job, basically you're monitor and respond to people's messages on the CPS Facebook book or Facebook page and through different social media sites. And so this girl messaged and she was looking for some help with her missing mother. And so I looked into it for her, and yeah, her mother had been missing for 2 years at that point. Her mother was kind of a person that would, had drug addiction issues and would be in and out of shelters. And so I promised this girl that I was going to look into, see what I could do for her. I just felt this strange, looking back, it's strange, but this just wanted to help this girl, and she wasn't getting the help that she needed from the people that were investigating, or whoever was investigating her missing mother. And so we had a number of messages back and forth, and I was doing what I could in the background. And then one morning I opened my laptop. It was September 16th, 2020. So I started work at, I believe it was 7 a.m., opened my laptop. So no one monitors these messages overnight, right? And so I was the first one to see them, and she had sent a bunch of messages overnight, basically a cry for help. She didn't say she was suicidal, but that was the gist of what her messages were, that she was trying to hold it together for the rest of her family, and that she was just really struggling, and she was reaching out to me for help. And my world just came crashing in on me, and I completely shut down for the first time in my life. I'd always prided myself on being able to react and to be not that person that freezes under pressure. And I completely froze. I just sat there looking blankly at my computer screen, and there was parts of my brain that were thinking of the things that I needed to do. Like I needed to call Res 1, it's called, and generate a check on welfare call for this girl, and do all the things that we need to do to make sure that this girl's okay. But I couldn't. I was just frozen in this weird state where like everything and nothing was happening at the same time. And I don't know how long I was in that state for. My wife eventually walked into the room and could see that something was wrong. She, of course, asked me if everything was okay. And I just stood up, and I just knew that I wasn't okay. And so I told my wife that I needed to call my boss. So at that point, I had a civilian supervisor. So I went up to my bedroom and I called my civilian supervisor, and I full on cried for the first time as an adult. It just poured out of me. And so trying to explain to this lady what was happening to me, while I had no idea what was happening to me, was a difficult conversation, as you can imagine. But even in that moment, I knew I needed to take some time and take a step back from policing. And so she was really great to deal with. She gave me obviously the day off, and I just had this knowing that I needed to be in nature. So I told my wife that I just needed to head out to the mountains. At that point, we were living in Okotoks, so the mountains are quite close. So I drove out to an area just west of Calgary called Elbow Falls. It's a beautiful area with waterfalls, and that's where the Elbow River, before it comes into Calgary. And I just sat there on the banks of the Elbow River, and I journaled. I wrote out where I was at and what I wanted to see going forward, and how I wanted to live my life. And I just knew that I needed to get help for all of the traumatic stuff that I hadn't dealt with up to that point. I just had this awareness that it was all of those incidents, those 5 that I talked about, that my coping mechanism of pushing them down every time they came up had run its course, and it was time for me to actually deal with them. And I just knew that I needed to get that help. And so I got that ball rolling that day, and I knew that I couldn't go back until I had gotten the help that I needed.
Do you think, and I could totally be wrong here, Nick, but this very real trigger of suicide, which sent you down the path of now recognizing that you broke your breakthrough moment, do you think that this suicide event that happened online was a trigger for you in some way, and it was kind of a window into past pain, past trauma that you hadn't necessarily dealt with? Because it sounds like the suicide for you over the course of your career is definitely something that definitely bothered you. You tried to control it for so long, and then at the end of your journey where you see your last potential suicide, all of these emotions that come along with experiencing suicidal calls as a police officer makes you fall apart. Have you reflected on that at all, as far as the trigger and why this event was the one thing that sent you over the cliff?
Absolutely. The suicide theme for me, it's not lost on me at all. That call and getting those messages, obviously not the most dynamic thing I've dealt with in my career, but it just makes perfect sense now with the benefit of hindsight that a suicide related call was the one that just brought everything to the surface. So yeah, absolutely. It was a theme for me.
An analogy I heard the other day from a former RCMP, I believe he had over 20 years. He's now in the role of a social worker therapist. And again, another beautiful story of hope and PTSD growth was this analogy of a beach ball. PTSD is very much a beach ball, and we're trying to shove it down into the depths of water to push it away so we don't see it. But over time, eventually that beach ball just gets harder and harder to either hold underwater or push down further, or the beach ball grows, right? The trauma grows. And eventually it's going to come back and pop out of the water and most likely smack you right in the face. And that's the moment where everything comes out. All of this emotion that has been stored for literally years comes flooding out, and you don't even know why. You can't connect the dots. How did you feel in that moment where that was everything coming flooding out? You touched on it. It sounds like you were fairly lost in that moment. But again, it's a very scary place.
Yes. Yeah. And I didn't have any insight at the time as to what exactly was happening to me specifically. And for a long time I was in denial, even after that I had PTSD, but I felt like this was a strong sign that I just couldn't keep on keeping on the way I had, and I needed to do something different.
After this moment of being lost in the emotion that comes pouring out, and the pressure cooker obviously blew apart, it was now all over the floor. In the moments, I'm sure you saw this as a moment of, what am I going through? How do I do this? Where am I going to need to go? Your wife was probably most likely impacted by this as well. She's trying to cheer you on and support you the best you can, or she can, sorry. But after you started to reach out and get help, what did this next chapter look like for you?
It was a real learning experience, just learning myself and gaining some awareness and insight into what I had went through and what all had impacted me to get me to this point. And you touched on, my wife who's been amazing throughout this whole time in my life. And without her and her support, there's just no way that I could have done what I needed to do to get the help that I needed. So what life looked like from that day was a lot of unknowns, a lot of being scared, and because I didn't know what was coming, I had no prior experience or knowledge of the WCB system or the long-term disability stuff, or like all of those, I guess, tasks that needed to be dealt with in the meantime. So I was just figuring out as I was going. But what really helped me was just, I just had this almost open book mentality, where if someone was asking me questions about how I was feeling or what my story was, I was just an open book. And that was really helped me through that, because I found people were very, very willing to help me specifically. And I think a lot of that had to do with just how open and vulnerable I was. And it wasn't a conscious choice, I don't think, I made to be like that. I think it was just like I had just cracked, I guess, wide open, and how I had dealt with things, pushing things down and minimizing and all of those things that I'm sure we all do to different extents, just wasn't serving me anymore. And so I just went all in on the other side, and just was, again, just an open book. And so I found people were amazing to deal with. Even, I know a lot of people haven't had good experiences with WCB, but for me, it was very painless, and it just kind of all flowed. If someone asked me to fill out this paperwork or talk to this person, I was just, yep, okay, I'll talk to them and tell them my story, I guess. And it led me to getting some professional help through psychologists. And that was something that I had no awareness of either, was that I needed to find a psychologist who really got me and I had that rapport with, because I went through several, and I wasn't getting what I needed from them. And that took me quite a long time to actually figure out. And then for me, I still had some denial of how severe, I guess, my PTSD was. And I just thought I just needed to get a new job, is kind of what I was thinking at that point. But as time went on, and time to reflect and just decompress, I became more and more aware of how it had slowly started to affect my day-to-day life in terms of my mood. And then all of a sudden, now I was feeling what I now know as anxiety, which I'd never had a frame of reference for that before. I'd felt different levels of anxiety along my life, I'm sure, but I never felt it like I did as the years went on. And so that awareness grew, and insight, I guess, into what I needed. And then for me specifically, again, is my frustration with the traditional psychological therapies and whatnot. It became more and more apparent as time went on that I wasn't getting better. I was staying the same. And then they would introduce a new program for me. And then that program for me was a return to work program that WCB put me in. And it was quite intensive. So it was 4 appointments a week. So 2 with a psychologist and then 2 with a occupational therapist. And so that program, called Return to Work, their goal was to return me to work. And that program re-traumatized me. And I had never felt as bad as I did after that program ended, because it didn't feel like there was no priority, no emphasis put on anything else except returning me to work. And that put me in a really bad place. And that led me that ended in December of 2021. So just this past December. And at that point I was at a real low point for myself. My mood was terrible. I had anxiety like crazy. I wasn't the father that I knew I could be. I wasn't the husband I knew I could be. I was just not myself. And I had this knowing that this traditional psychotherapy and, the eye movement and all that, while I did feel some benefit from it, there was a little bit of distance from my trauma. It wasn't getting me to where I needed to be. And so at that point, I Googled one morning, shaman psychologist, and I found my healer in a lady who coincidentally was based out of Calgary. So I Googled that, and the first person that came up was her, and looked into what she offered on her website, and it really resonated with me. And so I reached out to her, and I thought I would get her assistant or whatever, but I ended up talking directly to her, told her my story, and she wasn't in a position to be able to help me at that time. She was just too busy teaching and had other clients and whatnot. So she kind of put me off at first, but then she ended up reaching out the following week. She searched through her phone, through her incoming calls, and she called me up the next week. She said, "Oh, is this Nick?" And I was like, "Yes, of course it is." And she's like, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you all weekend, and we need to do this and get you the help that you're asking for."
The interesting thing too and we talked a little bit about this as we were just before we recorded, is PTSD is such a unique journey to us all. And for you to go through your journey the way you did, I don't have an ounce of judgment on you. You made the call for yourself. This is what I need. And I think it's really important for me to step back from the place of where my journey led me to, which was an addiction with medical cannabis, and how that impacted me. While substances at times can help PTSD, specifically medical cannabis for one, I do know a lot about it now. I'm practicing sobriety, so I stay away from it. But for you, you had this experience where you felt that you needed to go down a path of using a shaman, and I fully support it. I'm not going to come out and say, hey, what you did was wrong. From my own experience, would I promote substances being used in post-traumatic stress? Not from my own journey, but I also think too that your journey has a lot of value because you were able to get somewhere with it where you finally feel like you're healed. And I think that's the most important part of this story. Now, your experience with the shaman, and I am starting to, again, it's hard for me to comment on this because I don't have a lot of knowledge in the mushroom space, the psilocybin space. So I don't really know a lot about it, but I would love to hear kind of what your experience was like and how it did help you.
Absolutely. So and I'm just going to back up just a little bit to give a little bit more, I guess, reference or frame of reference. So for me, around that time when my sleep was really going downhill, so that was early 2020, I made a bunch of changes in my life right around that time. And so I started meditating pretty much daily at that time. And I made a major diet change as well. And then I actually rediscovered cannabis at that point in my life. And so I attribute those three factors. So the meditation, the diet change, and cannabis, it really just opened me up to a new perspective, I guess, and really allowed me to look internally. And so that all happened early 2020. And then to kind of line it up with my story, so that's when my sleep was going not well, and I had to get my hours restricted, and then went into that online role. And then my breakthrough happened basically nine months later. So I feel like those three elements almost accelerated my realization that I needed to get help. I honestly believe if I wouldn't have started with those three things, I could have pushed through another 10 years in this career and just pushed everything down and been miserable. It would have cost me my marriage likely. I would have been just not a happy person at all, but I could have done it. I honestly believe that I could have done it just through sheer stubbornness and determination. So now to come back. So now we're at December of 2021, and I'm at a real low point after this WCB return to work program. And I just had this again inner knowing that what I was getting from traditional therapies just weren't cutting it for me. And I knew that I needed to look into psilocybin assisted therapies. And so this psychologist that I found, who's a PhD psychologist as well as a shaman, she did all of the traditional testing and whatnot on me. And I came back PTSD, and then, but on the severe side of things. And then, so my diagnosis as this whole time has went on since I've been off work went from, originally it was called acute stress disorder. And then they called it, oh geez, you might be able to help me here. What did it go to? Acute stress disorder, adjustment disorder, and then my diagnosis went to full, I guess, PTSD. So this testing that my new psychologist did came back, severe PTSD. And so this is December again of 2021. So around that time, WCB was pushing me hard to go back to work. I was feeling terrible. I had actually never felt that bad in my entire life. My psychological well-being was at an all-time low, and they were pushing me to go back to work. And I just knew that was the last thing that I needed, and that would just bring me more trauma. And this new psychologist, with that testing that she did, was able to back WCB off a little bit. And so they gave me a little bit of time to work with her. And so in January of just this year, 2022, we arranged a healing journey. And so you mentioned it with psilocybin. And so my wife and I went to Calgary on January 28th, which was our 10-year wedding anniversary. And we got a VRBO in the city. And my psychologist shaman came, and the whole journey was, well, it was amazing, number one, but the ceremony part of it was really, really cool. So through my journey, I've become very spiritual. And so that was something that was really missing for me in my traditional therapies that I'd been through at that point. And so this ceremony was just very, very in alignment with my beliefs and with my spirituality. So there was drumming involved, and she had kind of an altar set up with different items that symbolized protection and whatnot for the sacred space. And she smudged the whole place that we were in and called in all sorts of protection. And then I held the medicine to my chest, to my heart, and I read my intention 3 times forcefully. So I'd written out my intention for this journey, and so it was a page long, and the gist of it was to process the traumas that I had not processed up until this point. So read those intentions 3 times forcefully, and then I consumed the medicine. And I had no idea what to expect. I'd never done anything like this before. And I kind of assumed that there would be a lot of, intervention, and she would be talking me through things, and we would be like, really, it'd be a real team thing where there was a lot of her guiding me through this. But for me, I just felt like I wanted to be alone. Once I felt the medicine start to affect me. And so I went into the bedroom of this VRBO we were in, and I just laid in the bed and snuggled under the covers and just got comfortable. And I didn't have any crazy, hallucinations or anything. And I had taken a large dose. It was a little over 6 grams. And so I didn't have any crazy hallucinations. There was nothing like that, what you would expect from hearing stories about mushrooms. I didn't experience any of that. I just naturally went to, and starting with trauma number one. So we actually already talked about it. So the girl who had slit both of her wrists. So I went back to that time in my life and that exact moment, and I just saw the situation from a very different perspective. And that was one of realization that it actually wasn't even my trauma per se. I was just a witness to the end of her crazy trauma story. And so that was huge for me, is just that realization that I was just a witness to someone else's trauma. And then the second part of it was I had this, and I call it radical Jesus level compassion for that girl and myself and my partner and those paramedics that were there. Just this compassion and just a totally different perspective of viewing them as a whole and seeing their story, that and all the things that happened to them in their childhoods and as an adult that must have been just horrendous to get someone to that point where they're actually going to kill themselves. And so I had this compassion, and it spread to myself. So I had compassion for myself for holding on to this trauma for all these years. And then through that process, it just released. I finally processed what I'd been pushing down for, at that point, basically 15 years. So prior to that, anytime that would come up, that memory, I would smell, like I said, the green apple, that synthetic green apple smell. It would come up and I would just push it down and just push it and hold it there, like the beach ball you mentioned. And now all of a sudden I just let that beach ball like float up and come through me and out of me. And then without even thinking about it or any resistance or any conscious effort at all, I went from that trauma to my next one. And I did that same process for my next trauma. And so saw it, I was just a witness to the trauma, and then that radical Jesus level compassion for everyone involved, and go through that. And then I'd move on to the next one. And like without even thinking about it, which is, when you think about it now, so go back to what my intention was. And my intention was to effectively process the traumas that I had not processed prior to. And the medicine just did exactly what I asked it to do. It allowed me to get to a point or place in my own psychological makeup where I was able to successfully process those traumas. And so I went through them one by one. It took, I don't know, about 2.5, maybe up to 3 hours, I would say I was in there. And during that time, the psychologist would come in I'm guessing, but every 15 minutes or so to check on me. And she would come in and she would like just tons of compassion for me. And she's just a great lady. And she would ask if I needed anything. And I was good. Like I was just going through it on my own time at my own pace. And I really didn't need any external help at all. I was doing it all on my own with the help, of course, of the medicine. So after about 3 hours, I came out of the room. And for anyone that knows anything about psilocybin or has ever experienced it, like 6-gram dose after 3 hours, I would have traditionally been still very much under the influence, but I was feeling great. And what still strikes me to this day is like that whole process, like revisiting all those nasty dark places that I certainly didn't ever want to go to. It was actually pleasant. It was a pleasant experience. There was no resistance. There was no, it was just a natural thing that just flowed right from start to the end. And so I came out of the room and I felt like having a bath. So I had a bath for, I don't know, another half hour, an hour maybe, and then came out and just sat in the living room with my wife and the psychologist, and we just talked about life and what was next for us, and just had a great conversation with her. And so I was feeling like, my wife now describes it to me, so I was quiet for the rest of that night, as the medicine had wore off at that point. And for the next day or so, like I was quite quiet and sort of, I guess, introspective during that time. I journaled a couple days later and had some insights into the effect that I'd felt since going through that process. And for me, it's the memory remains, of course. I was there, right? It's a memory. But any emotional charge that those events and that memory and that trauma ever held over me, it's gone. It's released. So the memory remains, but it holds no emotional charge over me. So now we're at the end of January of this year. December, I was severe PTSD. And then WCB ordered a comprehensive psych assessment, which happened at the beginning of March. So about a month after my journey, with an independent psychologist. So went to her office. It was like a half-day thing, interview and a bunch of standardized testing and whatnot. Did all of it. And in my head, so it's funny to look at it now, when I first went off, I was in denial that I had PTSD. And then, so I gradually accepted that and saw it firsthand, all the effects it had on me. And then now I go and sit in front of the psychologist. And even a month after my journey, I still thought that I still thought that there was something still there. It had some effects on me. And I didn't know what the results were going to be, but I expected to still have PTSD. So did all that testing. About a week later, she called me up and told me that I don't even fit the criteria for a diagnosis for PTSD. So I went from severe PTSD. 3 months later, I don't even have a criteria for a diagnosis. And the only thing that I did in that meantime was one psilocybin-led healing journey. So for me, the evidence is clear that medicine, combined with a clear intention in the right setting, with the right mindset and that calling to do that work, is an amazingly powerful tool to help people, and not just in the first responder world. I don't think it could help everyone in my mind. And I'm a huge advocate for it. And I think that it has the potential to heal the world.
And I think the beautiful thing about your story is that you don't do this alone. You reach out and you continue to get the help that you need. You engage with the support system that you know you need. You put a shaman in place and you go through this journey and I think alternative medicine is not really understood, especially the impacts to mental health and healing and all of the different things that you're now talking about through your own journey. So while I am conservative in my approach about, substances, I do also have to acknowledge that from your own perspective, it sounds like this was definitely something that was a very positive experience. Now, I'm glad to hear that you did this in a fashion where you removed any possibility for, say, addiction or substance abuse, and you did this with a team so that the team could guide you and you relied on them, because there was probably a certain level of experience and knowledge that needed to be there in order to help you get through this journey properly. Now, the reason why I love your story too is you take something that has plagued you for so many years, and literally within 3 months you say you are free of PTSD. And so many of our service men and women go through their lives, they retire, and then they continue to live on with PTSD until the day they die. Sometimes that's 20, 30 years, right? And the devastation that can hold in a family, not only to themselves, but spouses and children and parents, and the list goes on. So for you now, I mean, we're much further down the road. You've now retired. You recognize that you were done with this way of life. And I applaud you for that. My story was very similar in that sense too. I knew I needed to leave in order to truly heal. And I think that too, as a man and a father, we eventually have to challenge ourselves and ask ourselves those hard questions about what do I need in my life to make sure that I can be the best father and husband possible. And you did just that. So I really applaud you for taking that step, having to jump off the ledge of fear and give up the well-paying police officer job, the pension, all of the benefits that come behind it, because it is a good job at the end of the day, is a very scary thing, but you managed to go through so much transformation in such a relatively short time frame. So we are running out of time, unfortunately, but I do want to capture quickly kind of where you're at now with PTSD and your own healing journey, and kind of a little bit about what you're exploring now about building for yourself business-wise.
So since my healing journey, it definitely I've felt those negative things that were affecting me day to day. I've felt those basically, I wouldn't say disappear, but they have really, they're very minimal compared to what they were before. And so it's still I still have to be conscious of my thoughts and whatnot. I can still go down a bit of a negative road and not be in the best mood at times and not be the best father that I can be. But where before I felt like there was an external reason for that, now it's just like it's a maintenance thing where I just need to just be aware of it. And I don't feel like I'm affected by it. It's not ruling my life day to day. So I'm able to just be a lot more in the moment and not have something external like trauma run my show, basically. And so that the lack of diagnosis from that independent comprehensive psych assessment, it obviously it forced my hand in terms of, so once I don't have a diagnosis, WCB, my benefits stopped like that day. And then so CPS was expecting me back to work. And I have an awareness that, and like yourself, that I can't go back to that work. I'm feeling really good. I'm doing really well. But if I were to go back, I would be back in that same seat I was in on September 16th of 2020. And I've been able to come to a place where I'm not going to prioritize a paycheck over my mental health. And so I made the hard decision that I needed to resign and not ever go back to that world. And that's for my sake, for my family's sake. And it was certainly not an easy decision. You mentioned about the pay and the pension and the benefits and all those things. And again, without my wife's complete support, there's no way I could have made that decision. So I have nothing but amazing things to say about her and how great she's been, and how without her, there's no way I would be sitting here talking to you today. And I'd be in a very different situation, and it wouldn't be pretty at all. So she has a big part to play in my journey, absolutely. And then so for me moving forward, I've always had an interest in fashion. It's always been a thing for me, and I'm at a point in my life where I am just wanting to do something that I'm truly passionate about, and something that I am in control of. In policing, you don't have that control. You don't know what call you're going to. You don't get to decide when your next shift is. So doing my own thing, starting my own fashion brand, is just in complete alignment with where I'm at right now. So I'm starting a clothing brand that is local. So everything's made in Calgary, and it's made of natural, in my mind, superior fibers. So starting with a men's t-shirt, and so it'll be hemp and organic cotton. And I'm just going all in on that and seeing where life leads me.
Nick, I cannot think of a more beautiful journey for yourself to go through some of the hard things in life that pushed you to a point to be able to challenge your own perspective on who you are and the experiences that you went through. And not only that, but to go through such pain and suffering to get to a point where you can now reflect back on that and maybe the way you were at the time, whether you were the victim or whatever the case was in the story. But you pushed yourself to a place out of your comfort zone to challenge yourself in so many different aspects. And I think this is going to be such an impactful story for so many first responders that tune in and listen to this, because you cover such a wide range of things and challenges that you experienced. Not only that, but how did you get to a place where you now need to recognize that you need to go and get help? And in pursuing the alternative methods to gaining that help and the impacts that it's had on you has allowed you to grow in new ways and smash through some of those barriers that may have previously existed, right? The self-limiting beliefs and the fear of leaving the job. And you've touched on so many beautiful parts of the journey that make up PTSD. But here you are now on the healing journey. And I believe this healing journey continues for the rest of our days because of the things that we see and do. Unfortunately, they're always going to be there, right? They're always going to be stored on the hard drive. And that's okay. But you've gained the freedom now to accept them and go on and live a very healthy and balanced life and still continue to serve others through what you're exploring now is delivering clothing to people. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. I actually am strongly supportive of what you are doing right now in this pursuit. And I can't wait even for myself to be able to order something from you and to support you as well. So when this episode launches, I also want to give people the opportunity to reach out and support you, because I think that that is a beautiful part of building a community and establishing the connection behind some of the things that we go through for our veterans, for our first responders that, need to make that choice to leave. So Nick, I am so proud of you for what you've done with your life and how you've challenged and the beautiful people that are in your journey with you, your wife and your children, all of these amazing things. And I cannot wait to celebrate your success with you. I do have to end the show here just due to time constraints, but I did want to again thank you for the hard work that you've had to put into yourself to get you to where you are. And what an honor for being able to connect with you and for you to come on and share your experience. So thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you. And yeah, I just want to say thank you to you and what you're doing to bring this information to the first responder world and to be able to bring this out from under the carpet and have it in conversation. So thank you very much for everything you're doing, and I'm proud of you for your journey and what you're doing outside of that.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is Nick Motycka. He is out of Calgary. He has a beautiful story. It is one that I am going to walk away from and I am going to reflect on in so many different ways. Nick, once again, thank you. I can't even talk and close this down properly. But once again, thank you for coming on, and thank you for your kind words, even in my own journey. It is one hell of a battle, but with the right things in place, we can get through it. So we will end it here. Once again, thank you, Nick, and thank you to the people for tuning in, and anybody that can help support Nick, please do. He is on a new path in life, and he needs all of the support and deserves all of the support that he can possibly get. Nick, I also wanted to take a quick moment too to thank you for your service and your sacrifice, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you. And you too.
Thank you for joining us on Season 2. If you are a first responder with an incredible story into post-traumatic stress, please reach out and connect with myself. Season 2 is based on your story. And if you want to step up to the plate and share your story with the world, I would be more than honored to help you do that. Thank you for your continued support with this project, and thank you for tuning in today.